Welcome to the EW podcast. I'm your host, Eric White. Today, I am very pleased to share a conversation with friend, author, and podcast host, Zach Rhoads. Zach is the host of the podcast, The Social Exchange, and this has been a podcast that's been immensely useful for me after discovering it in the summer of 2020. For me, this podcast has been a useful learning tool in my ongoing process of becoming a better question asker. If you take a listen, you'll hear that Zach is a great thinker and has a natural knack for using what's called first principles in his interviews. Also, the Social Exchange has a bunch of great guests. It features conversations with prominent thought leaders like Michael Shermer, Johann Hari, Anthony Magnabosco, and many more. Zach is also the author of the book Outgrowing Addiction, written with Dr. Stanton Peele. In this book, they make the argument that the disease model of addiction is wrong, while also presenting an alternative to the most common addiction rehab program, Alcoholics Anonymous. His book, Outgrowing Addiction, and the shortcomings of the mainstream view on addiction are the main topics of focus for this particular conversation. I highly recommend checking out both the Social Exchange podcast and the book Outgrowing Addiction, which I did read in the time leading up to this conversation. You can find links to both of those in the show notes for this episode. In this episode, we discuss the problems with Alcoholics Anonymous and also touch on where it gets things right. We talk about Zach's views on the disease model of addiction and why he believes it's incorrect. We also touch briefly on Zach's own history of addiction to heroin, how he outgrew his addiction, and the role his experience played in developing his ideas about addiction, among other topics. If you'd like to follow Zach or his podcast, you can find all the relevant links in the notes for this episode. There you can also find links to sign up for the EW Podcast monthly newsletter or follow me on social media should you like to do so. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Zach Rhoads. Okay, I'm here with Zach Rhoads, author of Outgrowing Addiction. Thanks for joining me, Zach.
Eric, thank you so much. Really nice to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad we were able to finally make this happen.
Me too, man. I love your podcast. So I'll put out a plug on your own show.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and you're also the host of the Social Exchange podcast, which I'm also a fan of. It's been a really great listen. I was just checking out this isn't on the Social Exchange, but the Dax Shepard breakdown you did with Dr. Stanton Peele. And I found that really interesting. Maybe we can get into that a little bit today, as that's definitely related. But yeah, the main purpose of this conversation is to talk about your book, Outgrowing Addiction, and how the addiction model that we currently have might be completely wrong.
Yeah, I agree. It's wrong.
So before we get into that, maybe we can give the listener a little context on who you are and your experience with addiction, like what qualifies you to write this book. Why should we be listening to you?
It shouldn't really. I mean, there's nothing that qualifies me more than the next person who thinks critically about these things. I mean, I do have experientially, I had an addiction in my life that I've overcome on my own. And as far as research goes, I mean, I feel I've gone the depths and done the right kind of thinking about it. But I'll answer more toward what your people will probably want to hear. I'm a child developmental specialist. So I work in schools with kids who exhibit challenging behavior, which a term I hate, but it's common parlance. So, high octane kids or kids who have difficulty or who are having, who can't seem to catch the wave of, new pedagogy or anything like that that comes. And I've done that for a long time. And I even had an addiction in the course of working with kids, which I can get into in a little bit. But when I kicked my addiction, which was to heroin, no less, I thought, wow, this is interesting how I overcame this without any of the standard sort of therapies and treatments that people are often saying you must undergo. And I thought I was sort of like beating the system, or I was an anomaly or a strange person in that regard. And I found out that not at all. I mean, this is actually the vast majority of people have this experience that I do. If they get bogged down by, heroin monkey on their back or whatever other sort of drug addictions they might have, or any kind of addiction, they tend to overcome them over time. And it's a term that I coined, outgrowing. The addictions are outgrown. And the reason I say outgrown is because the ways of escaping addiction, the antidote to and antithesis of addiction, are just normal channels of human development. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, I'm still not answering your question very well. I started a podcast a long time ago about child development. The podcast was called Young Justice. And I don't know, it's a cheeky little title, but the point being that I don't think we're doing justice for the kids that we're trying to serve in our education systems, and I think we all know it. And so here's some tricks I figured out to, being the best educator you can be without, while still living inside of the system, or being the best parent you can be. And I got to talking to some of the people whose books I read and channels I follow and things like that. All in a row, I got Michael Shermer, Carol Tavris, and Stanton Peele on my show. Michael Shermer is the founder of Skeptic Magazine. Mm-hmm. Carol Tavris is a social psychologist, and she wrote the book "Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me." That's basically the definitive book on cognitive dissonance. Mm. And Stanton Peele is this guy who is an addiction writer, researcher, psychologist. And I admired his work because he wrote a book called "Addiction Proof Your Kids," all about sort of child development, the things that I'm interested in. And so I got a lot of interest from a lot of people right away, just because I think I was interviewing high profile people. Mm-hmm. Got connected with Stanton after we did that interview. And Stanton, Dr. Peele started writing to me and saying, "Hey, fun interview." This is the first person I ever get like a call back. Like, "Hey, that was awesome. So what do you think about this?" And he'd send me an article. And I'd say, we got to talking, and a year later, we're still just in communication, doing deep dives and analysis on, different things that we're thinking about. And what we came to realize was that my work in child development mapped on nearly directly to the work he does with adults who are overcoming addictions. Same kind of process, same kinds of principles that help ameliorate those kinds of problems. So he offered me, "Hey, would you like to write a book?" And I said, "Oh my God, that's crazy. I don't feel like I'm qualified to do it, but sure." And I got around to, this is, I don't know how many years ago, but a handful, 5, maybe, I don't know. I got around to doing really, really deep research. I've already been thinking and researching and doing trainings on child development. Now I'm got into deep research about addiction and development. And so from there, we did a lot of writing together, a lot of researching together. He actually trained me proper to be an addiction counselor in his program that he has developed. So I've been doing that all the while writing the book. So I've got my direct experience with kids, my own experience overcoming addiction, now a lot of research, and I write for various publications about addiction and research and consult various groups and do counseling, addiction counseling in Dr. Peele's group. So all of that together while we're writing the book, I guess, made me qualified along the way to write it. But really, to go back to and I'll cap it here. I know I've been talking a while, but
no worries.
To go back to my original answer, there's really nothing about that whole learning process, researching process that made me, uniquely qualified, besides the fact that I, do work with kids in schools. Mm-hmm. To have written the book. I did a lot of learning very fast and very efficiently along the way.
Cool. Yeah, that's great. And I think more details of your own experience might come out in some of the questions later on. But yeah, let's get into Outgrowing Addiction. I found it very fascinating. It touched a chord with me. I found myself kind of reflecting on my own experience as I was reading it and seeing that things made sense because, I went through a depression for about 10 years. And during that time, abused alcohol pretty heavily. And, I eventually got out of it and I have a fine relationship with alcohol now. Sometimes I overdo it, but I don't need to drink every day. I don't need to, I can have one drink. So it's, I managed that addiction while still being able to enjoy it. And there always seemed to be a piece missing of like, okay, this trauma happened. how did the addiction come out of that? You know, how did you suddenly start drinking so much after this point that happened in your life? And I think the thing I really liked about Outgrowing Addiction is it kind of gave some texture to how that addiction might have developed and how I was able to kind of manage that in the future. So I really appreciated that part of the book.
Thank you.
Yeah.
May I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What about your drinking? This is total curiosity. I'm not leading you somewhere, but what about your drinking? Do you feel made it an addiction for you? Like, how did you recognize it as, addictive or an addiction?
Oh, I mean, it was a daily thing, almost a near daily thing. You know, I remember specifically one time I was on an Amtrak train. I traveled a lot for a year, just like hopping trains. And, I would get a full bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey, go on the train and just drink it by myself, just like feeling sorry for myself. And I would say the thing that makes me believe it was an addiction is that I wanted it and I didn't have a healthy relationship with it, but it was something I wanted anyway, right? You know, so I guess that's why I view it as an addiction.
And what got you to the point that you decided you needed to change your relationship with it?
There was a couple serious events that happened while I was drinking that made me realize that I needed to, for one, cut back on liquor and start to develop a better relationship with alcohol in general. But it kind of like coincided with me coming out of my depression of like the less depressed I felt, the less I felt like I needed to drink. There wasn't like a specific point where I was like, okay, I need to do this. It was kind of more of a gradual thing that happened as I got my shit together, you know?
It's interesting.
Yeah.
So like as your life, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. And it's less like, oh, I have this horrible drinking problem, I need to do something about it, something's got to give. And it was more like, as upon reflection, as your life was being pieced together in a balanced way, you noticed that your relationship with alcohol seemed to get healthier as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there was still habits that I had as I got better. Like I would still at parties tend to overdo it. And I feel as though that was just a habit I had built into my body where it was like, okay, you're at a party. Now it's time to take some shots, do some, heavy drinking, where it was like, okay, now I need to undo those habits maybe and start to right the ship. But yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you for letting me do that. I'm always curious when someone says that they identified with something in the book. I'm always super curious about what their experience is. So
yeah, no problem. And happy to share. Yeah. If there's ever anything else you want to know, let me know. But yeah, in preparation for this interview, so let me preface this question by saying that I talked to a couple friends who have gone to AA and one of them is sober now and doesn't plan to drink ever again. And after talking to them and reading your book, I do tend to agree with the perspective presented in the book more so than I think that their experience is universally applicable. Like I think the things in your book are more common sense, really. I mean, that's how you end the book is like, this is kind of a common sense approach. But that being said, I do want to take some time here at the beginning to kind of push back on some things and kind of take their perspective and maybe just see what your response is to it.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah. So one thing that they both said, and in the book, you detail your own experience with AA and how it didn't work for you, how you weren't able, you're kind of a skeptic by nature and you weren't able to, I think it was the God thing in particular, the higher maker was a real sticking point for you, right?
Yeah. And that's in that story. Yeah, that's very true. That was one thing. Yeah.
So each of them, they each were in AA for multiple years, and it helped them get clean. And so they view AA, and I think they would agree with you on many things, in particular, the disease model of addiction that we currently have. I think they both agree that that's wrong. And that was kind of one of the reasons they stopped going was because they were tired of having to say, I'm an addict, and reliving that period in their life. but they both really appreciated AA for being an entry point for them into sober living. And, they both kind of moved on into other spiritual realms. And they both seem to say that without AA, that growth wouldn't have been possible. And in the book, you kind of you don't say AA is the worst thing, but you do take a stance against it. And so I just wonder how you might talk about their experience, and is there room for a program like AA with other approaches, or do we need to just rethink AA completely?
That's a really good question. And I think about this a lot. Well, I work at this online program I mentioned called the Life Process Program, and I do counseling with people there. And we very much take a harm reduction approach like we talk about in the book. Harm reduction meaning we're here for you if you want to do something. Obviously, tacitly implied by somebody signing up for a program, there's something they want to change. But we don't label someone and we don't tell them how they ought to change. We ask them a lot of questions about what it is they might like to change, try to hold a mirror to them and say, and then, so what is needed in order for you to make the change? How can we be helpful in you making the change? And a lot of those people are in AA. So it's something that we think is kind of funny because our program, sort of like that chapter in the book you mentioned, you can see how we totally oppose it philosophically, because we want to make sure people feel that they have agency, responsibility, and self-worth enough to make their own decisions on a first principles basis, not because there was something prescribed to them, not because there was some ritual prescribed to them. And at the same time, it's all encompassing. So we say, you do what you want to do. We shouldn't tell you that you need to do one thing or another. So in that respect, our program is open to people who are doing something like AA in a way that I don't think that AA can replicate on the other end. I don't think that somebody who wants to take a total harm reduction approach is as welcome in the AA groups as AA would be in ours. And so that's the distinction. It's not that philosophically we're opposed. If you have to ask us, do you totally agree with this model? Well, no, we don't. There's a lot about the model we disagree with. But when it comes to should a person into the program, should a person not? That's a tough one because my answer is I don't. Everyone has their own reasons for doing what they do. So I'm not omniscient. I wouldn't tell someone to do it or to not do it, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. That being said, the thing that we're pushing back against most is not the existence of AA, especially as a social benefit, because a lot of people go there and don't agree with any of the principles like I did, and they get some social benefit out of it like I did. We are opposed mostly to AA and the medical field being in cahoots, as it were, enough that it reigns supreme over so many dimensions of medical care, life, even like human resources, and the courts and the justice system. So where I just talked to a man the other day named Bill Kinkle is his name, and he's a nurse. He was a nurse for a number of years, and he self-identified as someone who had an addiction and had to leave his nursing practice so that he could get treatment for his addiction. And the only type of treatment that he was allowed to get before he could reinstate his nursing license is 12-step oriented treatment and disease-oriented treatment. So what we're really pushing against is the idea that 12 steps ought to be at all ever mandatory, as opposed to people being able to think and make their own decisions for life being mandatory. Philosophically speaking, the thing that we disagree with most is, I guess, two things. One, the sense that people must surrender their what AA calls their best thinking. They say like your best thinking got you here. So the idea that people need to surrender what they think their best thinking is to something more omniscient, to a powerless state. And the other thing we disagree with most is the idea of sobriety being the goal. So, you just mentioned how you have a relationship with alcohol and that needed to just become like a more mature relationship. Whereas AA would have had you, if you were entering AA, it's not like you'll be, everywhere's different, but it's not like you'll be physically removed from the place if you said that you're still drinking and want to learn more about it. But I can nearly guarantee you that you won't feel very welcomed in the groups if that's your perspective. And so that's our philosophical difference, is that if people want to totally cut ties with a drug, alcohol, or any other kind of relationship that they form that's a dysfunctional one, then that's what they want to do. And so we, as a clinician or a counselor, the best thing you can do is ask people questions about why they came to that decision. Ask them if it's a forever decision. Ask what they might do if something arises in the future where they might want to drink or something like that. AA just doesn't have that. It doesn't. AA itself hasn't matured to meet, human common sense and 21st century demands.
It's like a lack of flexibility, kind of.
It has nearly no flexibility. It has wisdom, a lot of wisdom packed behind it. I just interviewed a man named Massimo Pigliucci, who is he just wrote a book about Stoics, and there's a serenity prayer that you do in AA. Grant me the serenity to change. Well, whatever. I can't remember. Accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And that's very much, a 1,000-year-old, thousands of years old Stoic sort of a mantra. And they have these like Buddhist leanings, spiritual leanings, but they don't change. It is a text, and it's a prescription for a way to live life. So anyway, in a soft way, we oppose it philosophically, but we oppose a lot of, there are a lot of things we want to oppose philosophically, but we don't care if someone wants to do it. It's not our job to judge. The chapter was more about how 12 steps have become infused in everyday life, and people are demanded to encounter 12 steps, even if their own personal philosophies oppose it.
Right. Yeah. And that makes sense to me. Like as I was talking to one of my friends, he mentioned, he got a DUI or something and was required by law to go to 20 classes or something. So yeah, that seems to me like it, you need to give people the choice of how they're going to better themselves. I mean, maybe the goal just needs to be, you need to prove that I don't even know what that looks like, but I think that you're right in that, requiring people to do one specific program that has zero flexibility is probably not the best. But I do want to go back to the thing you said about goals, sobriety as the goal. And, for me, that worked to not have sobriety as a goal, to have other goals, like feeling better in myself. Purpose and community are two things that are huge in your book. And they were huge for me. But I wonder if that's right for everyone. There's people who are really far down the rabbit hole with their addiction, perhaps, something like heroin or a full-blown alcoholic. Is it going to help them get better if they aren't willing to fully give that thing up to begin with? Because I'm just imagining someone who loves drinking, loves shooting up or something, being told that no, sobriety is not the goal. And it kind of becomes like a backdoor thing where they're like, ooh, okay, I don't have to be sober. I can still do this thing and, have a good time. How do you view those cases? And, is sobriety sometimes the goal? Does it sometimes have to be the goal? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm just not in the business of telling people what their goals ought to be.
Yeah.
So that's just never something we do. I would never tell somebody that they need to do one thing or another. And a good therapist or counselor will ask what the problem, to try to figure out what the problem seems to be so that they can identify, predictable times of the day or in someone's life or schedule or routine that these things come up, who is involved, and what you think would be ameliorative of that problem. And from there, you kind of figure out what goals would be. So if you went into a program like that saying, oh, you have an issue with drugs, well, you need to kick the drugs and now let's figure everything out. It's skipping a lot of steps. Whereas but likewise, you wouldn't say, look, let's try not to give any drugs up, and let's figure out how you want to move forward. Harm reduction isn't about saying, I think there's a misconception. Yeah, a lot of people think that harm reduction, or the book we wrote, is trying to tell people you should continue to use substances or things that you like. There are different ways of going about this. But what we're saying is that you should first think about what are causing problems in your life and what you want out of life, and let yourself be open enough to decide how you want to go about that. And all the while, just know that there's nothing magical or different about drugs or alcohol or anything like that that would make it so that you could never do them again. And so the question of, does that open the floodgate? I don't think if someone is really, not if someone's in tune with what they want out of life, as long as someone's choosing, the only rule I would say for, drugs and alcohol and a good life, sobriety otherwise, would be something like you want to choose conscious living over total oblivion. I think that's pretty unbalanced, universal. Other than that, I wouldn't tell somebody one way or another. And I don't think a lot of cities have their like Skid Row. And even though there aren't any of these in the US, there are drug consumption, safe consumption sites of drugs in a lot of countries. And people go there who, at least for the time being, have no desire to stop using drugs. But clearly they have a desire to make a change that is more healthful for them and maybe for others. So people go there to exchange syringes, meaning, that implies, well, I want to make a change from using what would be an unsterile syringe to one that you provide me. Or I want to use drugs, but I don't want to die. And so if you take an approach that says you have to kick drugs, that's the only way you're going to move forward, you eliminate a person's ability to make decisions for themselves in a more open and honest kind of a way and connected kind of a way like that. All of the small changes that could be made before someone decides to give up a drug. And then you also put a ceiling, you also make a decision for a person. So you want people to be internally motivated to do something, or else they're really not going to be 100% motivated. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question fully.
That does for sure. Yeah, it does for sure. I could still see people pushing back on that. I agree with it.
Tell me, we should get into it. I think we should.
Yeah.
What do you think the pushback would be?
Well, I just think that the pushback might be someone like I had this conversation with my girlfriend the other night, and she was saying, there's just some people who are so far into their addiction that maybe they don't even know what they want or what is really going on. They are just completely motivated by their addiction. That is the only thing that they can see. They have lost, maybe this is someone who's been drinking alcohol heavily for 20, 30 years, is really far gone. I guess, to me, it does maybe seem like there are certain cases where sobriety should be the goal, but then I see what you're saying in terms of everything you just said, how that shouldn't be the goal, because then they're not going to actually stick with it, and they're skipping steps. They're not going to actually make the changes in their life that they need to make to be a functioning person. But I think that those extreme cases present a kind of sticky ground with this, where it's like, how do you deal with someone who isn't in tune with themselves and is only living for that next buzz?
Well, I know that one way that you really can't deal with it. I mean, if somebody like that comes, or anybody comes to me and says, I've got a problem, which I do, and I say, well, you have to remain sober, or you shouldn't go for sobriety as the goal. You should try to figure out a way to just reduce harm along the way while you're still using. They have every right to say, well, who made you God? Why am I deciding that for them? And so to me, that's where things get sticky, is that if we say, well, that's all well and good for some people, but really some people need, they need a mandate or something like that. My question is, who decides that? And so maybe it seems obvious to me that somebody should really stop something or do one thing or another. Even if it seems really obvious to me that that's the case, I don't get to tell them that, but I can do my best to say, look, you're saying that you don't want to kick the alcohol. And it sounds like every time that you've had a situation come up that you're coming to see me for, it's involved alcohol. How do you reconcile that? What are you going to do about that? How about next time you start drinking? Do you think you'll be able to stop? And that's you may be familiar with this, but it's just a form of therapy called motivational interviewing, that really gets people to say themselves what the problem is. It's like a Socratic dialogue, and I can say, I can push back the same way that you're like giving pushback or playing devil's advocate for what I'm saying now, you would do for a person and their own choices, and then have them run these thought experiments about, well, if what you're saying is true, what would A, B, and C look like? I think that's about as close as we can get ethically to, even if we have a bug in our head that says this person can't be drinking anymore, or this person can't be whatever. I think that's about as close as we can get to helping them along with that decision.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the book, you talk about wet houses, I think it is. And there was one in Seattle where people are allowed to consume alcohol, where you can have a place to live and not have to give up your addiction. And I wonder if these kinds of models, like if we abandon the sobriety as the goal model and say, you know, you can live here, you can drink, you can partake in your thing, we're going to surround you with community and hope you get better. Is that kind of accepting a lower quality of life for people who end up addicted? You know, is it, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, that was really the question is that kind of just us accepting that some people are beyond the pale and we should just keep them from dying. You know? Well,
I think that in the last three questions, I think the thing that you might be misunderstanding, or someone who might be saying that would be misunderstanding, is that places that accept a lifestyle that's already existing, nowhere do they say like, you know, you shouldn't continue to better yourself, or you shouldn't, you know, and in none of those cases would they say you can be here, but you have to be someone who's using drugs or drinking alcohol if you want to be here. I mean, in all of these places that exist, you know, syringe exchanges. I have one here in Burlington, Vermont, right down the road from me. But all the places in the world that have, you know, safe consumption sites or wet housing, like in Seattle. The idea is if you take a look around us, you see that realistically there are people who are behaving in certain ways, and some of those ways are destructive, and somehow they're not being reached in a helpful way. They're not doing anything to better themselves, and if anything, their lives are getting worse. And so this approach is saying, let's see if maybe just having a corner of the world for these people to make human contact without being judged might help them get as good as they can get or want to get. So you don't say like, you can be here, but look, we're going to set you up on a regimen to quit drinking, or else we've seen that these people are just back out doing everything they've already done. If you accept somebody who's already out drinking every night, sleeping in an alleyway, to a place called a wet house where they have other forms of connection, people to talk to, safe, you know, places to make safe choices, you're at least initiating that sort of software in a person's brain that says, oh, I'm worth making better choices. And I don't think at any point along the way somebody forms an identity, a new identity as a drinker, or says that, okay, good, being a drinker is the way to go and it's fashionable. Actually, to the contrary, a lot of people who access these places wind up doing better over time, because as I write in the book, most people actually do, assuming they live long enough, most people do, quote unquote, recover after a while. So the idea is, can you keep somebody alive, help someone stay alive long enough to access what they need to become, you know, self-aware?
Yeah. And I guess it also gets into, what are we defining recovery as, right? Are we defining it as someone who kicks their addiction completely and is sober, or is recovery is just doing it less enough to constitute recovery, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the DSM definition of, well, they don't use the term addiction, but they say substance use disorder or something, whatever it is. They talk about disorders. But, you know, something that causes general impairment and distress over time would be considered an addiction. So enough that you're trying to seek professional help for something that causes you impairment and distress. So in any studies and surveys that are measuring whether somebody's still addicted or not addicted, like the National Epidemiologic Survey of Alcohol and Related Conditions, which is a government survey. They do, you know, they talk to like, I think it's 43,000 people each time, and they make it representative of different ages and demographics. And all those people, you know, not 80 to 90% of people who have addictions to drugs or alcohol, they kick it over time, but they're not gauging that based on, did they completely abstain from alcohol? They're asking questions about, does your relationship with alcohol still cause you impairment and distress, or is it more balanced over time? SAMHSA, which, God, I'm thinking acronyms and I can't think of what the SAMHSA acronym is now, but it's a drug similar to the National Institute, Drug Abuse and National Institute of Health, is an organization that defines it based on 4 pillars, which are home, health, and I think it might be, it's like something that can, it's not these, but it's employment and connection, that kind of a thing, does a pretty good job. It sort of stems from Freud said, he was asked what is the meaning of life, and he said to work and to love. That's, pretty much captures most of what the human being needs.
Yeah.
There's someone else was quoted, he said, what do people want when they ask for help? It's like, they say, a job, a roof over your head, and a date on Saturday night. And pretty much we're taking a really common sense view of what recovery means. We don't say recovery in terms of someone was using a drug and being recovered means now they're not using a drug. It's how is your life? And if it's overall good based on some pretty, regular standards, then we'd say that somebody would be recovered.
Okay. One of the things that got brought up when I was talking to my friends was the kind of shame that's built in with it. I have a friend who's still going to AA and stays sober. And I believe that this person would tell me that AA is a huge part of their life and they're very thankful for it. But can you just talk about I think in the book you detail a little bit about how you're replacing like your addiction with now this kind of battle with the devil, where instead of being addicted to something, now you're like fighting something. Can you just talk about that a little bit, and maybe we can get more in depth on that?
I think you framed that so well that I don't even remember what section you're talking about, but that's a nice way to say that. So when you're in an AA group, it's like, if you remove just, let's say we've only talked about drugs and alcohol so far, although I certainly don't limit addictions to that. But let's say it's a drug or alcohol. You remove that from the equation, but you still have all of the dimensions of your life that may have been in disarray to sort out. So if you go to AA and you're doing it in earnest and you're not drinking and you're following the precepts, and you still are trying to figure out the rest of your life. And I think a lot of people become reliant on, the text, the meetings, the living by a series of prohibitions that are involved with AA. And yeah, I think that certainly happened for me, although I'm not saying, my experience can be just extrapolated for everybody. But I do see a lot that people are, they start to follow these rules, and stop me if I'm not answering.
No, this is good.
But they start to follow these rules and demands to an extent that they have actually built an unhealthy relationship with AA. It's like they can't distinguish AA from life. They're white knuckling it through life, and once they have a really hard time, they've got to get back to the AA meeting. I'm not saying that can't be, that's not necessarily a betterment for somebody than if they were, injecting with unclean needles on every morning, afternoon, and night. Maybe a regimen of getting back to AA and not doing those things is better than what they were doing. But if you're going to ask me what I think helps a person overall live a happy life, there has to be a sense of personal agency and also foresight into the future, that, hope in the future. Like, not only do I have the capacity to make changes and be flexible and deal with, any slings of misfortune that life might throw me, but that I have the ability to create that into the future as well. And because I have that ability, the future is going to be pretty good.
Yeah.
I think that might be what's missing from somebody who replaces their drug, their inebriation with meetings and being sort of enslaved to meetings and being a complete follower rather than a participant in their own recovery.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And the approach that you guys have really makes sense to me in that, going back to the replacing your addiction. I mean, the thing with AA that struck me while reading the book was that, you go to AA, you have an alcohol problem, you go to AA, you're now sober, not drinking, but you're still thinking about alcohol. It's like alcohol is still a central part of your life, It's
like, don't think about a white elephant kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, it's just interesting for the people that it does work. And I wonder how, can it be said to be working if that person is stressful in their life still because of that substance? I I was a big alcoholic before, but now I go to AA and I don't drink anymore. But now every time I see a beer, I'm like, oh no, I don't want to drink that because I don't want to have to go to my AA meeting and feel ashamed, and I don't want to have to, relive my problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. That gets into why Stanton Peele and I got along so well, is that when I talk to educators about what it means to teach a kid, it's not like there is rote learning involved. I'm not going to say that there's not. You want to know math, you want to know basic subjects, but at the end of the day, a good educational philosophy is how can I prepare this child to be in this world, to deal with life as it happens to them, or be a participant in life. In the same way, an adult, going to AA meetings, first of all, you're not going to get me to say that people shouldn't go to AA,
right?
Or people never should. In fact, I know I'm friends with a lot of people. One person is a man named Dr. Rick Barnett. And I remember watching, you and I are met in the Unity movement, which I don't know how much you've talked about on your podcast, but I saw Eric Weinstein one time talking about having an intellectual arch nemesis. And this guy, Rick Barnett, he's a psychologist here in Burlington, and a lot of people know him. He is staunch into 12 steps, and he and I disagree so fundamentally. We could have conversations like you and I are having right now. We can get into depth about all the things we agree with, the fundamental building blocks of life, what's true, what's not. And we love the way that the other person thinks. We're like intellectual sparring partners. We have a really great time. We could do tradings together. We have a complete disagreement fundamentally about the why AA is good or why it's not good, or why it's beneficial or why it's not. So I know a lot of people who, get use out of it. And I know a lot of people who are even clinicians, psychologists who they know enough to not recommend one thing or another if it's not going to work for a person. But they wouldn't, if someone said, well, I'm in 12 steps and I think it's saving my life, it's not like he would say, are you sure? Or something like that.
Yeah.
Whereas because of my bias, if I was my own supervisor and I asked supervisor me, should I question this person about AA? Supervisor me would say, definitely not. Let things play out. I mean, if you're going to ask them about it, just ask how they see benefit in it. But, I have my own leanings, and, I might have that disposition to push back on somebody there.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I think that if someone is stuck in if someone relies on AA as their only source of betterment or gratification or feeling of connection, and they don't have other sources, then I think they might be selling themselves short. And that's not exclusive to AA. I think that's true for anything that somebody comes to over rely on.
Yeah. So basically it's like if AA is making your life better, cool. Good for you.
Better is better.
Yeah. Better is better. Yeah. Cause I can think of a couple friends. Well, one friend in particular, I wonder if this person is listening or not, shout out. But who has gotten a lot of benefit from AA. And I would never tell this person to stop doing that, even though, like you, I may disagree with some of the things they're doing. But this person has come so far since starting with that. So it's like,
I would never tell them not to either. At the most, I might wonder what this person's getting out of AA and whether they think that they couldn't get it through other channels of life. And I might ask them about it, like in a genuinely curious way. That's the difference between, like, you're working with a human being to make the choices that they want in their life. You can't be judgmental about them. But if I'm tasked, which I was by a publisher, to write a book about what's a good philosophy for kicking addiction, in that general, in that broad sense, I'm talking about AA in a way that I'm sure your friend's not going to like, but I'm not excluding AA from the list of possibilities for living a better life, for sure.
Yeah. The argument is essentially there should be more options. We shouldn't look at AA as the end all be all, right?
Right. Absolutely. Well said. You could have saved us like an hour if you just framed my thinking that way. Yeah.
But as you mentioned, like the argument that you guys are making is partly philosophical, and just disagreeing with the AA philosophy. And my question about that, which comes from another friend who I talked to before this, is, does it matter? does this question matter if for some people AA does work? Does it matter that they get the good results if their philosophy is wrong?
Well, what matters to us is that people hear a wealth of information that trends toward truth, rather than being completely bogged down by what we think of as dogmatic. There's the National Institute of Health and the National Institute on Drug Abuse is dead set on calling addiction a chronic relapsing brain disease that you just have. The best you can do is try to keep it at bay. And you do that with either medications or meetings or some form of abstinence and coaching and counseling. But we're just trying to say that that's not, if you look at what helps people beat addiction, just first, if you look at sets of people who are just completely left alone and ask, how did they get over it? There are ways of getting over it that the disease model is not touching, or not actually reflective of. Mm-hmm. And then we say, if you look at modes of therapy, well, the numbers are vast of people who just don't get any help and they live a good life. And then if you ask, well, when it comes to different kinds of help, what help, statistically speaking, has been more effective at helping people move forward with their lives? It's actually not AA. By AA's own numbers, there's a man named Lance Dodds who did these out. He's a Harvard psychologist, and he wrote a book called The Sober Truth. And he detailed that AA, by default, it's Alcoholics Anonymous. So it's kind of hard to get studies from people there. But all the same, they've run their own sequence of studies, and they admit that it's somewhere between 5 or 10% of people who use AA that long-term remain abstinent. And then there are other internal studies that are worldwide that show something more like between 3 and 5%. I mean, let's split the difference and say, let's even say just 10%. I mean, if it works for 10% of people to remain abstinent, then that leaves 90% of people who are trying AA that the method doesn't work for. And that's not even to mention that maybe abstinence isn't the best goal. If you're abstinent and an asshole, no, I shouldn't say that. But if you're abstinent and cut, if you're, are we live? If you're totally abstinent and you don't feel like your life is great, maybe it's either marginally better or no better, or it's difficult to tell if it's better than when you were using drugs. Maybe it's not the only goal. So we're looking at this and saying, what does help people? What would we do to help people? And the reason why we would do this is because if you actually take a very a wide look at what helps people move forward and better themselves generally, and with respect to addiction, we all kind of know the answers to it's out there in the literature. You get more in like general psychology, like Martin Seligman, people like Angela Duckworth that we mentioned in the book, people who are talking like positive psychology. How do people get better? And it's a lot of prospection. Do you have a sense of the future, solid, healthy outlook on the future, optimistic outlook on the future? Do you have something that you're passionate enough to work very hard on to become better? Do you feel like you have self-agency? Those are generally agreed upon as ways people better themselves. And what we're saying is that one set of philosophies, 12 steps, the disease model is saying you can't do that with drugs. Drugs are bogging you down more than other things in life might bog you down. We're saying drugs might be bogging you down, but drugs are not the sole problem that a person has in life. And drugs are not an exclusive category. Drug use and deciding to do drugs themselves follow all the same rules as other human behavior. So it matters to us, to answer your question really in a sentence, it matters to us that people understand a range of options and what it means to do better, to better yourself and not feel like you're limited because they think drugs are something special. So it doesn't matter, I think, if a person has all the relevant information and decides on one track or another. if someone doesn't have all of the information that they could have about, how to live a better life, and they're told they ought to live one way or another, that's what bugs us. And we see that does happen, not for everybody, but it's fairly ubiquitous that people are, wind up in systems even though they wouldn't have decided to go there on their own.
Yeah. Why do you think there's such a focus on drugs specifically without looking at the underlying things? Do you have any sense of why the spotlight tends to be on drugs?
Yeah, historically speaking, well, at first it was I think it came from a misunderstanding. It looks pretty, you could steel man the argument, and it looks like, in the years of Prohibition, and different societal problems that went on, and you wanted to just do a correlation. A lot of the people who were having the most trouble seem to also be people who are drinking or using drugs. So historically speaking, people kind of link those two things, even though, marketers, people in the country knew better. When you were able to legally sell diamorphine and heroin in stores, people weren't so worried about, isn't heroin going to kill everybody? And indeed it didn't. But obviously there were problems, and I think that I'm trying to be as fair as I can, because I want to say, and I think this is true to an extent, looking at drugs as the source of the problem sort of gives a simple solution, kind of an answer. If drugs are the problem, then we have one single enemy. We can all target it. So that was, I think, unjustified sort of thinking through years of, hundreds of years of American history. But also then there came a point where, because of this way of thinking, people who use drugs or were called addicted were seen as, total moral failures and people who should be either incarcerated or dealt with punitively. And the medical community decided at some point, and this is really highlighted and became pervasive in the late 1990s, 1997, that we could call this thing a disease, because if we do that, we would get funding. And this is not just me, what's the word? I'm not just saying, this is not my speculation. This is the National Institute on Drug Abuse in writing explains that the basis for calling drug addiction a disease is in part that it would help get people funding for medical treatments.
Wow.
So they have this box that they now need to fill. It's like they're saying, okay, we call addiction a disease. That gives us this, ways to get people help. So, it came from a good place. Now, how do we prove it's a disease? And so 90% of the research at the National Institute of Health that has to do with drugs and addiction is funded in order for experimenters to double down on, to continue to prove that drug addiction is a disease. Very little research money and grants are going to research to see why drugs may or may not be the problem, or if there are other things that addiction is, or if there are other involvements that people could have that are also addictive. So I think that we see it started from a trend of an initial misunderstanding, a trend of wanting to help people. So we say if we call it a disease, then at least we're saying people are sick rather than people are bad.
Yeah.
And then we follow the money that has been perpetuated over time.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate. It seems like you can always just follow the money.
Yeah.
I think in the book, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm forgetting the acronyms here too, but it seems like the medical community has been more willing to shift their perspective on addiction as a disease. Is that right? And it's kind of been the mainstream thought leaders like the New York Times, Huffington Post, these other mainstream outlets that are slow to catch up, right? Is that correct?
I think that's how it goes. On one hand, at least the medical community will budge on some basic things, like with the rise of medication-assisted treatments. At least they're saying something like, if somebody prefers an opiate, rather than say, well, you have to be abstinent from this, you can say, here's an inexact but fairly similar form of the drug that you can take, and we can monitor you. That's a medical intervention. And so it's not that they're not saying it's a disease, because I still think that's very much embedded in medical literature and attitudes, but it is saying like maybe there's more than one way to go about this. But I think the medical community and the the columns and mainstream media and everything else, they kind of fuel each other, because it's nice to have these. It's great to have these stories about. It only takes one pill. Mm-hmm. I had a guy on named John Koch who works at an organization in Arizona that's a medication-assisted treatment facility. And on my show, The Social Exchange, my basis is I'd like to have people on the show, whether I agree with them or whether I don't. And I actually don't take the position where I push back a lot on someone I disagree with. I give everyone the same sort of platform to explain their views. Anyway, this guy told a story once about it took one pill and then it was done. People love that shit. People love the drug took me over kind of a story. People love to tell it. It's an easy story to tell. And so I think that fuels the kinds of medical interventions people are looking for. And at the same time, I actually don't think the medical community is doing any favors to our attitudes, given that if we're seeing the problem as solely medical, then tacitly we're saying, well, okay, it's a medical problem, then it's a disease. So our idea is that we need to break out of simply medical solutions or abstract mechanistic brain kinds of solutions, and to just standard folk psychological common sense ways of dealing with humans. And that we have to stop thinking about drugs as like a bug in your software that you need to keep at bay.
Yeah, that's one thing it seems to keep coming up on this podcast this year in interviews I've done, is just the loss of I'm going to say spirituality here, but what I really mean is like an over-reliance on science and, wanting to have some sort of scientific fix for every problem. I don't know. It's a real bummer.
Yeah. That's a huge, a really big misinterpretation of what we're doing, like in our book. And I think what you're saying is that it's not scientific, because didn't show any charts, or we're not talking about brain mechanisms or anything like that. But I completely disagree. I think that the most scientific thing that a person can do when they talk about best ways to solve a problem is privilege parsimony. And, if you explain something, so if I wanted to say addiction is a disease and it's because, neurons are firing this A, B, and C way, well, that's just a reductionist view that doesn't explain anything. What we're doing instead is saying, based on the best evidence available that's actually relevant evidence, here's what we can come up with. If somebody can further that analysis, then that's scientific. Scientific isn't jumping to the let's blow your minds kind of quantum theories. Yeah.
That's. I mean, how do we change that? How do we pull back from that sort of way of thinking? And I know books like yours, Johann Hari is another example of someone who's kind of in that same lane of saying, connection is the thing that we're missing. Is that what it takes? Is just us, people like you and Johann kind of speaking out against this? Is there a shift happening at all that you see, perhaps?
It's hard to tell. I think in the addiction community, it's starting to trend. It could be trending that way. Although, well, I'll be optimistic. I'll say I think things might be trending that way. Who knows how to best run a society? But the answers that we do know, things that we do know, are, I think, probably as simple, not simplistic, but simple as what Johann is saying in terms of connection is a bulwark against something like addiction or depression. And at the same time, I think that personal agency responsibility is also a major factor. And so people don't have those if they don't have adequate resources or, attitudes that promote connectedness. So yes, I think it's as simple as being more connected and being more self-actualized. But at the same time as that is a simple diagnosis of the problem, I don't think that would be an easy fix. Still have society is worth the people to do that. I guess I want to say that I have the fix for it, a solution, or I could draw a map. I think that'd be sort of a grandiose way of speaking for me to do that. But I can say that all evidence points to that. Like maybe someone smarter than me will figure out a way that we can get together and do these things. But I at least don't want us to see it. At least don't want to see us running the wrong way. The opposite direction of what's true.
Yeah. It's a big task.
Yeah. I try to think about it just one interaction at a time.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the best way, right? Is to, that multiplies itself, right? People, but I guess that's another problem, with the, people who go through AA and live sober lives are much more vocal than people who kick their addiction themselves and still drink. That person isn't going to be putting on seminars about how you can still drink even though you're an alcoholic. And what is that? What's going on there?
Yes. So brilliant that you said that. I agree. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to include my story in this book, at least to some extent, because it's kind of a non-story. I mean, really the story is, I decided to use drugs. I had a lot was going on in my life that I needed to sort out. I used drugs, but then I decided not to, and my life is pretty good now. That no one wants to watch that movie. That's not a Hollywood blockbuster. That's not an interesting story. That's not a juicy headline. So, that you're right. I think people who go into this programming and are dead set on that is going to change lives, and then they're going to trumpet it, and they're going to be louder than people who are telling just natural stories. I think the only way to counteract that is by saying, wow, so many people want to trumpet these stories, even though it doesn't make up a majority of people. And maybe that's what mobilizes people to start telling more basic stories about what is true. I think you mentioned I did a little analysis of Dax Shepard's own recovery story.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit.
So that's the example of a guy that actually my wife brilliantly said, because when we listen to his podcast, my wife and I both listen to it, and we think he's a super smart guy, like really enjoyable, and he thinks things through at a deep level. And he's this big AA guy, and we wonder if he decided to make life changes now at this point, if he would still be such an AA following kind of a guy, or whether really what happened was he decided to make life changes at a time where it was fashionable to be in like programming like AA, fashionable, maybe spiritual, and it was looked at as kind of a virtue. He had the story was saleable, and then so he had to preserve that story. I think that might be the case. I'm not playing God. I don't know, but all I know is that it's quite possible that if he gave himself more options and was a little bit easier on himself, rather than saying something like, I did a drug, that was my stupid addict brain working. If instead he said, I did drugs at this one point in my life, it seemed to be the thing I wanted to do. Like it did make me feel good. It was sort of enhancing for a while. And then eventually my drug use got carried away. I wonder what was going on with that. He kind of had to say like, well, that was my stinking thinking AA, not AA, addicted brain going haywire, making excuses for myself again. The distinction, I guess, would have been, rather than calling it excuses, just saying doing reflection. And anyway, I think needing to tell those stories because they make somebody relevant, or make somebody more, they feel like they're more interesting because they can tell them. I think that gets in the way of doing an actual deep reflection.
Yeah, and maybe that speaks to why those kinds of stories are more romantic too. It's because you're actively doing something. And I mean, this goes back to like the fighting the devil kind of thing, where you're fighting the good fight every day. You're resisting temptation. You are doing something heroic. Whereas if you're an addict and now you have a drink every once in a while, it's like, oh, well, what are you doing? You're not standing for anything. And it's a weird thing to try to flip on its head, right?
Good point. Yeah, good point. If you're, it's almost, I guess, it's almost like you're saying got to be careful about taking too seriously any given story about somebody's own success. Not that they can't be relevant or good or true, but it's like sometimes the best lives lived and the best things that people can do are just do the living and not have to tell a sexy story about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not to put down anybody who has sober living. Like, I think, for some people it works, and that's great.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it would just be really nice for people who have found other ways to be more vocal about it, and to widen the scope of possibilities for people who are going through addiction. Because yeah, I mean, it's got to be, I can think about my own experience going to AA, and there's a certain amount of like motivation that also plays a role in it. Like, I went to AA one or two meetings, didn't get anything out of it, didn't buy into it. It was just like, these people here are way worse off than me. I'm not that bad. And then later I was able to stop abusing alcohol because I had a series of events happen in my life. I committed to therapy. I had a loving community around me. And sometimes I wonder, if those things were switched, was I just ready at the time that I was able to give it up in a way that I wasn't whenever I went to AA, right? So there's like this whole timing thing of like, when is a person ready to actually commit to a program? When are they ready to give up their addiction? Which is an interesting thing to think about. And I don't have an answer.
Sure. You got me thinking about, so I mentioned, and you mentioned that I had spent time in AA when I was trying to kick my problem with drugs. And it did give me a sense, I think you even just mentioned this, that I was doing something instead of nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And so the reinforcement that I got from that was a reason for continuing to go. To be honest, there was a long period of time where I was attending AA meetings where I thought, this is really bullshit. And, I'm not to talk about all AA everywhere, about just my experience there and the certain rooms that I was in. But I didn't know another way to signal to the people who would want me to be doing better that I was doing something instead of nothing. It was easily, if I decided I don't want to go to meetings, I might be saying, that might signal to other people that I just don't, I'm apathetic. I don't care. I now know that I could put in those people, what they really want for me is to be happy. Anyone I care about who would have cared whether I was going or not, they really just want me to be happy. They want to know, like, are you doing meaningful work? Are you having good relationships? Are you being healthy? Are you taking care of yourself? And so if I could signal to people those things, then maybe that would have been a different way to go. But I wouldn't have been able to think that through at that time. That's what I want the book to help people do. Just think through the basic elements of what it means to change and just a different perspective. Yeah. Different language. Yeah.
For sure. And that's an interesting point too that you just made, is that there's a certain pressure that that you perceive to be coming from your community whenever you're struggling with an addiction, where like you said, you want to show that you're actively doing something. And so AA becomes the most available thing. Like, I'm going to these meetings. I go every day. Look, I'm let's have dinner. You can hang out with me because I'm doing the work. So that's, is that a similar thing with the Life Process program? Like, can someone be like, hey, I'm doing this thing. Check this out. I'm participating here.
Maybe. It might be. I guess you could have that problem with anything.
Yeah.
Although what we're doing in the Life Process program is a cognitive behavioral therapeutic approach. Mm-hmm. And so a cognitive behavior therapy, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but in case your listeners aren't, it's basically saying, you obviously have a problem, and you should tell us what the problem is. We're not going to tell you. And then once you are able to think through and articulate what the problem is, let's see if we can get you on a track of rethinking your place in that problem so that you can make decisions for yourself in the future. In other words, CBT ends. It's not we give you tools and things to think about, ways that you might want to structure your life, and then we say goodbye. Mm-hmm. And we're here if you ever want to use a program again, you can come back. So it's sort of like people don't rely on our group forever. We try to work ourselves out of a job and give people some tools. And
people can graduate out of the program.
Yeah, people end the program, and a lot of and a lot of people do. Actually, some people. This is good. I think it's good. It's not. No one in marketing would say that maybe this is good, but we try to front load the most helpful advice that we can think, the most salient and universal advice in our writings, and then in the way that we form questions that we get people to answer about themselves, so that when they're answering those questions, and there's always a counselor able to give feedback, they might just, and a lot of people do, say, I see what you're saying. So I have, I've been thinking about it this way, and maybe A, B, and C. So I guess what I really need to do if I'm going to be successful is, okay, I'm going to go give it a try. And so we get a lot of letters that say, we have 8 modules of our program. And people are supposed to do 2 a month. And people after the first month say, I'm on module 2. I'm sorry, I don't want you to think that I don't care about the program, but I think that I've got what it takes to, go and do whatever I need to do now. So thanks for the program. And maybe I'll be back if I ever need any help. And we're always happy to see people leave on those terms.
In the book, you mention Italy as an example where drinking culture is started younger, and so people grow up tending to have a less abusive or reckless relationship with alcohol, specifically wine. How, something like that doesn't seem possible with something like heroin, right? Like, we can't have a heroin culture that's healthy for people starting young. How do you view that sort of mechanism in Italy as it relates to more dangerous or harmful substances?
Really good question. Right. So what you're mentioning is that we took a look at cultures and trends regarding alcohol use and, what's taught through culture, how people are learned through osmosis to have relationships with things like alcohol, and then what, the trends look like as they get older. And in places where, and a lot of Jewish cultures in America, even, and places across the world where alcohol is used as sort of a ceremonially, and the relationship with it is like we use it, and it does make us feel well. It enhances our experience in like dinner parties and things like that. You can drink it when you're young. Here's what maybe you shouldn't do. And there's this whole, I forget his name, Albert Bandura is his name. He created a model called social learning theory, which basically was saying, when kids are growing up, they learn more through their peers and their friends than they do through things that are passed down from their parents. Not that it has no value, and I think that's true. When you create a culture around something, people grow up not really needing to buck against different kinds of information they might get about alcohol or drugs or other things. They grow up fairly certain about their place and that thing's place in the culture. You're asking about, and so those places don't have a lot of, college age, at least not to the extent that we do in America or Canada or places like that. They don't have a lot of college age, binge drinking, passed out drunk death because they're mixing alcohol, different substances kind of issues.
How did you know about my college experience, dude?
I asked all those friends you mentioned earlier, and they said, yeah. Right. Well, that was my college experience too, because it gets a little confusing. You hear messaging from media, you hear messaging from the school, you might get a different message from your own household, and people tend to learn through whatever their peers do, and the reactions that people have, that kids as they grow up have about how they might use substances varies, but it tends to be an ignorant, uneducated one by the time kids are going to college. The thing, I don't know the best way. I mean, probably people aren't deciding to have their 13-year-olds or whatever, smoke opium or do heroin with them at the dinner table. Yeah. I mean, it just might not be ceremonially or enhancing at that point. But one thing we could do differently is be a little bit more honest about what those things, the risks and the benefits of different kinds of drugs. In school, I taught at a high school, and it's like you're not really allowed to say to a group of students something like, heroin has risks and it also has great benefits. Here are some of the benefits. or if you are going to say that, you have to be really careful about how you to make sure that no one goes home and thinks that you're glorifying heroin use. At the same time, Johann Hari talks in his book Chasing the Scream, quite rightly. You break your leg in England, and you go to the hospital and you get diamorphine, which is heroin. And most of the people go to the hospital and they get that heroin, and then they go home and they don't need it anymore. They're not addicted. They're not being captured by it. And so the danger stories here are like, well, it just takes one time, or, once you start using drugs, it's going to capture you forever. The fear tactics around it don't match the actual experiences, because kids are going to experiment and to figure it out anyway. And then people come not to trust the very people they should trust in order to get information about things like drugs. So I think maybe it would be, something we could do is to make our culture and understanding and honesty about drugs, a little bit more cultured and just completely honest, that people, maybe we don't want kids 10, 12, 13, 15 to just be taking drugs just because it's a better way of life. But I certainly, I have a daughter, if she's going to get a surgery when she's older, like her wisdom teeth surgery, and she's in deep pain, I hope they'll offer her opioids. So, it's not that we have to be ceremonial about it. It's just a way to say, once you can be honest about a drug, its effects, then you come to realize, and people come to realize through their lived experience, that these things aren't like a sacred or weird or strange or thing that you can only do behind closed doors, or and you wouldn't want your grandparents to find out about. They're just normal things that people do. I love Carl Hart's the chair of psychology at Columbia University, and he came to a training here in Burlington and explained to people that he uses heroin. He goes to these heroin injection facilities in Switzerland, and he knows how to procure a good heroin that's pure. And he says, I use drugs. I take heroin from time to time. They're like, oh, yeah. Like, so what? He's like, so, I mean, I do it once every so often. I don't, maybe it's like once a month, once every couple months. And it's the same as like, I have a few drinks. And, if you take away all of the stories that we've heard about drugs forever, and if you actually use first principles thinking, common sense, and think about, you compare and contrast drugs, there really is no grave difference between doing something like having a few drinks at a party or taking a little bit of heroin whose dose whose effects you're aware of, before something like a party. He says, his quote is, I'm an academic. I'm the chair of psychology at Columbia, so sometimes I have to go to these functions with boring ass people. And once in a while, I'll take a sedative. Sometimes it's heroin, and that makes things like a lot more tolerable for me.
Wow.
And then I go to sleep, and I wake up bright-eyed, bushy-tailed the next day, go to work, and I don't think about it again. And it would be nice to get to a place where our attitude around drugs was like not interesting. Like, drugs aren't that interesting. They're just things. Just like wine maybe isn't interesting.
Yeah.
It just is.
He's an interesting person. He's an interesting person. I think he's got a book coming out, or maybe it's already out, like Drug Use for Adults or something like that.
Yes. Drug use for grown-ups. He'll be on the show soon.
Nice.
He's on the Social Exchange soon, and we'll be talking about it. Yeah, he's been a great inspiration to me.
Cool. Yeah, can you imagine a DARE officer telling kids that heroin has some benefits?
I do heroin. Oh no, I can't imagine. No, I can't. I really can't imagine, and that's really perverse to me. Yeah. Because it's like we knowingly won't communicate with the people who we know we need to communicate with. So if there are students of ours that are either likely candidates for drug use in the future, or people who might be using drugs right now, I mean, in my mind, what you'd want to do with those people is have an open dialogue enough that they trust you to talk about their experience, and that you could guide it and talk sensibly about how they can stay safe and alive and live decent lives, rather than say, the people who use this are bad people, or if you use this, you're going to be sick and you're in this forever cycle, leading people to this to a self-fulfilling prophecy that, well, I am already using drugs. I've been told that I'll be dead or I'll be sick if I'm doing it. So why stop now?
Yeah. That makes sense. That reminds me of when I got into tobacco. Tobacco was always something really talked down about by my mom. Love my mom, but this was one thing that she talked down about a lot. And I remember the first time I did it with friends, I was like, damn, I was doing chew tobacco. I was like, man, this is so sick. Like, it just blew my mind. And I had this, like, I don't know, it became a secret thing that I would do. And I felt really like, I don't know, it was a weird thing. Like, if you think about how that could have been different, a more honest dialogue than telling me it's going to kill me one day or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Having to hide whatever your habits are. I mean, you had reasons for doing it. Maybe they weren't, maybe if you rethought it, you could have had better reasons for doing something else, but having to do what you're doing in isolation because you don't have anyone to talk to about it or think through it with is pretty dangerous to me. Yeah. So that was another reason for the book, which I'm glad you brought up.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your time, Zach. This has been very enjoyable.
It's been a great time for me too, man. I mean it when I say that I've listened to your show. And by the way, I've listened to the episode where you've interviewed your mother too. And, you ask questions in a way that make people want to give you a full, good answer to them. Whether I complied or not, I don't know. It's up to our listeners, but I really like your interviewing style and I like your show. So thank you.
I appreciate that, man. And the same goes for you. The Social Exchange has been a joy to discover this year. And you in particular as a person, your work, I definitely appreciate your willingness to, ask tough questions, be the odd voice, and not conform to what everyone else is saying. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, likewise, man. That's why I'm having you on the show soon.
Yes.
So I don't know when people will hear this, but sometime right around when we roll into the new year, you'll be on the Social Exchange. So hope people will tune into that.
Yeah. And you can find the Social Exchange anywhere you listen to podcasts on YouTube. And also make sure to check out the book, Outgrowing Addiction.
Thank you so much.